With his trademark wisdom and insight, Jordan Peterson has once again uncovered a truth that will challenge and inspire us all.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. It's true in that it provides the basis for truth itself.
Let us heed his warning and embrace the challenge of confronting our inner darkness.
What in the world is going on there? Because that's a hell of a thing for anyone to say about anything ever. And it's right, because what does that mean?
As Peterson delves deeper into this discovery, he uncovers a world of darkness and evil that most people are completely unaware of. He warns that this evil is not only present in the world around us, but also within ourselves.
We're not the sorts of creatures who should be subject to tyranny. And then the tyranny might be, well, is it the tyranny of a state? Or is it the tyranny we impose on ourselves? And I would say probably both. Why not both? The story could be referring to both. We tyrannize ourselves with our own presuppositions all the time. And then you might ask yourself, why? Why don't we just give up our tyrannical presuppositions?
With each passing moment, Peterson's warning becomes more urgent. He insists that we must pay attention to this message before it's too late. The consequences of ignoring it could be catastrophic for humanity.
And so what if it's the case that even to escape from the tyranny of your own presuppositions, that you don't go from the tyranny to the promised land, you go from the tyranny to the desert? And who the hell, excuse me, wants to do that? And the answer is no one with any sense. It's like, hey, I'll just keep the tyranny, thank you very much. At least I know where everything belongs there.
Peterson reveals that the Bible contains a dark and dangerous message that has been overlooked for centuries. This message holds the key to understanding the nature of humanity and the dangers that lie ahead.
It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. You know, it's really interesting that it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. And that's really interesting, you know, that something in some sense so evanescent can be so long-living.
In a stunning revelation, Jordan Peterson has uncovered a terrifying discovery hidden within the pages of the Bible. He warns us that this discovery is not for the faint of heart, and it will shake the very foundation of your beliefs.
There's a very large amount that we don't know about the structure of experience, that we don't know about reality, and we have our articulated representations of the world, and then you could think of outside of that, there are things we know absolutely nothing about, and there's a buffer between them, and those are things we sort of know something about, and we don't know them in an articulated way. It's chronological. They have one floor, which is the history of the Bible. But it's not exactly that. It's really what it is the history of the book. Now, in many ways, the first book was the Bible. I mean, literally, because at one point there was only one book. Like, as far as our Western culture is concerned, there was one book. And for a while, literally, there was only one book. And that book was the Bible. And then before it was the Bible, it was, it was scrolls and it was writings on papyrus. But we were starting to aggregate written text together. And it went through all sorts of technological transformations. And then it became books that everybody could buy, the book everybody could buy. And the first one of those was the Bible. And then it became all sorts of books that everybody could buy. But all those books, in some sense, emerged out of that underlying book. And that book itself, the Bible isn't a book, it's a library. It's a collection of books. And so what I figured out was, partly because I was talking to my brother-in-law, Jim Keller, who's the world's greatest chip designer and has now designed a chip that's as powerful as the human brain, which is optimized for artificial intelligence learning, by the way. So now then you think, well, let's think about the relationship between words. Well, some words are dependent on other words. Some ideas are dependent on other ideas. The more ideas are dependent on a given idea, the more fundamental that idea is. That's a definition of fundamental. So now imagine you have an aggregation of texts in a civilization. You say, which are the fundamental texts? And the answer is, the texts upon which most other texts depend. And so you'd put Shakespeare way in there in English because so many texts are dependent on Shakespeare's literary revelations. And Milton would be in that category, and Dante would be in that category, at least in translation. Fundamental authors, part of the Western canon, not because of the arbitrary dictates of power, but because those texts influenced more other texts. And then you think about that as a hierarchy, okay, with the Bible at its base, which is certainly the case. Now imagine that's the entire corpus of linguistic production, all things considered. Now, how do you understand that? Like, literally, how do you understand that? The answer is, you sample it by reading and listening to stories and listening to people talk. You sample that whole domain. You build a low-resolution representation of that inside you, and then you listen and see through that. And so it isn't that the Bible is true. It's that the Bible is the precondition for the manifestation of truth, which makes it way more true than just true. It's a whole different kind of true. And I think this is not only literally the case, factually, I think it can't be any other way. It's the only way we can solve the problem of perception. And the answer to that could easily be, well, you probably should have read the Bible. And maybe that's a claim that you could make about wanting to understand any book. Because if you mapped out the relationships between all the books that there are, you'd find that the most fundamental book is the biblical library. And I think that's even merely true historically. It's partly why the Museum of the Bible was so interesting to me, because walking through it, you see how the book aggregated itself across time and became fundamental. And the first book that was really widely available for printing, purchasing, and reading was the Bible. And all the books that we know about now, on the millions of books that we have, emerged from that base, that trunk. And they're all related to that. And it's certainly possible that without an understanding of that fundamental book, you can't understand all the other books. And maybe it's possible that without an understanding of that book, you can't understand other people. So, to be people of the book means that we're all inhabited by the same book, but it's probably more complicated than that. Like, it's not just the Bible, because there's lots of books. It's the biblical corpus, which is a library, and it's the relationship between all the texts in that book to one another, and then it's the whole structure of the relationship between all the texts that grew out of that. And you could imagine a map of that, and then you could imagine that what you do as an educated person is sample that. And so there's this structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization. And then there's you as an agent that needs to understand that structure. But you can't read all the texts, obviously, because how much time do you have? Nowhere near enough time to do that. You have to sample it in a way, though, that gives you an understanding of let's say, of the gist of it, something like that. And maybe the best way to do that in a fundamental sense is to become familiar with the biblical writings per se, and then to move on to other literary forms from that. One of the ideas I've been wrestling with here, and you guys can think about what you think about this, people of faith, Christian faith, believe that the Bible is true. But that's never been that satisfying to me, because I don't know what they mean. I don't know what people who make that claim mean when they say the Bible is true. It's like, well, what do you mean exactly? Is it true like a videotaped recording of what you did this morning is true? I would say, no, it doesn't seem to be, because who cares about the videotape recording of what you did this morning? There's nothing about it that's relevant or interesting, except peripherally. Well, really, even when you talk about your day, you don't say everything you did. Who wants to hear that? No one. And you know that, not even you. You don't want to, watch a videotape of your morning the next morning. So that's an interesting thing, because the videotape recording would be true in some sense, but it's irrelevant. Who cares? It doesn't matter. And so maybe if it doesn't matter, there's a form of truth it isn't, because maybe there's a form of truth that's the truth that matters. That there's an identity between what matters and the truth. And I think these old stories, the biblical stories, are condensations of what matters. That's what they really are. And I think they're true, not like history is true, if we think that by true history we mean something like literal or empirical history. The Cardinal Technique. It's like if I can find out what you're avoiding and get you to confront it voluntarily, you'll get better. And the reason seems to be is that if you get people to confront what they're afraid of, and sometimes what disgusts them, but what they'd like to avoid, let's say, if you get them to confront it voluntarily, that could be the future even, you know, the indeterminate future, they don't get less afraid. They get braver. And that's different. It's not like they get accustomed to what they're looking at and they're no longer afraid. That kind of happens, but it isn't really what happens. What really happens is they discover there's a lot more to them than they thought. And so they're not as easily intimidated then. And so if you run a clinical client through a session of exposure therapy, maybe they're afraid of an elevator or something like that, you get them so they'll go in the elevator, then sometimes they're often women, because women have anxiety disorders more often than men. One of the unintended consequences of that often is they'll go home and have the fight with their husband that's been brewing for 30 years. Because they're now braver. They see themselves in a different light because they've confronted this thing that terrifies them. And so it's so interesting in that story that God's cure for the venomous serpent is voluntary exposure to the source of terror. It's so interesting that that's the case. But that, and this is relevant to the issue of suffering, right? And confronting suffering dead on, to actually focus your attention on that which you would like to avoid. Fair enough. I mean, this is a very serious question, and it's an open question in the Exodus narrative whether the desert is worse or better than the tyranny. And so, and you know, you see this in the real world. Lots of people in the Soviet Union pined for the days of Stalin. So I read a book once that was reminiscences of an extermination camp written by the guards. The good old days. You know, so I don't think there's a tyranny that's so brute that we can't long for it if it's been shattered. And so that's quite something, all that packed up in that story. Anyways, so the Israelites are out in the desert, and they're there for 40 years, and you might think, well, what kind of leadership do they have? It's not that big a desert. And the answer is, yeah, but you know, the desert after a tyranny, that's no bloody joke, and maybe it takes 3 generations to get through it. And that's possible. And so there's all that, and then the Israelites are wandering around in the desert, and what happens? Well, the same thing happened to them as is happening to us. They're worshiping false idols, and they're tempted. And it's no wonder they're tempted, because, well, they're in the desert. It's like it's not going so well. It's no wonder they're having a crisis of confidence, you know, and maybe they're pining for the old days, and they're not so sure that the God who informed them that being the subjects of tyranny was wrong, because now here we are in the desert. And so they lack faith, and it's understandable. But despite it being understandable, and this is one of the harsh things about the story, what does God do when he hears their complaints? He sends poisonous snakes in there to bite them. I think that's pretty brutal. You know, and that's the sort of thing that makes the technical atheist type sort of recoil about conceptions of God in the Old Testament. It's like, it's not exactly what you'd expect. First of all, they were in the tyranny, then they had to go across the Red Sea. Now they've been wandering around in the desert, and that's not good. And so your best solution is to send a bunch of snakes in to bite them? But you think, well, you know, even if you're in the desert after a tyranny and you lose faith, then the snakes are going to bite you, right? Because that's what happens. Because if you're in, you know, a little analog of hell and you lose your faith, is that going to make it worse or better? And the answer is, well, I have reason to lose my faith. It's like, fair enough. That isn't the question. The question is, what happens if you lose it? Or you start looking for faith in the wrong directions? And the answer is, hell gets a little deeper. And it's one of the things that really frightened me. I spent a lot of time studying atrocity, and I realized on a metaphorical level that the reason hell is a bottomless pit is because no matter how bad it is, there is some bloody stupid thing you can do that will make it worse. You know, I want you to come away having things put together in a way that you can immediately imply. I'm not interested in abstraction for the sake of abstraction. Rational, well, it's got to make sense, you know, because the more restrictions on your theory, the better. And so I want it all laid out causally so that B follows A and B precedes C, and in a way that's understandable and doesn't require any unnecessary leap of faith. You know, because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that? And so I don't want any uncertainty at the bottom of this, or I don't want any more than I can get, than I have to leave in it, because I can't get any farther than that. And so it's going to make sense rationally. I don't want it to be pushing up against what we know to be scientifically untrue, even though science is in flux, and that's, you know, somewhat of a dangerous parameter. If it isn't working with evolutionary theory, for example, then I think that it's not a good enough solution.